Hi, I'm Bailey, and today I'll be exploring the fascinating and controversial environmental movement of the 1980s and 1990s, when environmental causes became incredibly prevalent in both American and international policies, and the idea of environmental justice took the nation by storm. The environmental justice movement. The environmental justice movement was a huge aspect of these decades. Minorities and the poor of America are those who must live, work, and play in polluted areas due to their socioeconomic standing, and this began to be nationally recognized. This injustice was coined environmental racism. This movement argued that all people should have the right to a safe and healthy environment. It concentrated on issues like urban air pollution, lead paint, and the location of transfer stations for municipal garbage and hazardous waste. As the 1980s began, people of color were under assault from the threats of hazardous waste landfills, garbage dumps, diesel bus and truck garages, incinerators, chemical manufacturers, radio waste storage facilities, and more. America had become one of the world's most industrialized societies, and its minorities were suffering from the repercussions. This is evident in the case of Afton in Warren County, North Carolina, a rural and mostly black community where the state government dumped 6,000 truckloads of soil containing toxic PCBs. This resulted in nonviolent direct protesting, in which residents met the trucks bringing PCBs, which could leak into their water supplies and lay on the road in front of them. Civil rights activists saw events such as this as an extension of racism that they had been enduring for centuries. They used similar tactics: marches, rallies, petitions, forming coalitions, empowering communities through education, litigation, and, as seen in Warren County, nonviolent direct action. It was evident that a pattern had formed. Facilities producing heavy pollution are normally located in poorer ethnic communities. Those with power have found that low-income, African American, or Latino communities are cheaper and easier to site these facilities in. They lack connections to decision makers, or they can't speak the English language, or they can't afford legal defense. Many environmental justice organizations formed during these decades, many of which are still strong, permanent forces today. In the late 1980s, the Concerned Citizens of South Central LA was formed to fight against the Answers incinerator, and in 1998, the West Harlem Environmental Action was created to fight the siting of a sewage treatment plant. Also, many studies published during the 1980s and 1990s proved that environmental racism was a huge issue. Congress's General Accounting Office found that in 1983, three-quarters of the hazardous waste landfills sites in 8 states were located in poor African American and Latino communities. A 1987 report called Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States, published by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, showed that race was the most important factor when determining where toxic facilities in the U.S. were sited. In 1990, leaders of this environmental justice movement searched for allies among traditional white environmental organizations. That year, many environmental justice leaders signed a widely publicized letter sent to the Big Ten environmental groups. This letter accused them of racial bias in their policy development and within the hiring of their boards, and challenged them to address toxic contamination in colored, poor communities. This caused many mainstream environmental organizations to develop their first environmental justice initiatives. The environmental movement in politics. 1990 was also significant due to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Environmental Justice. A group of prominent academics and advocates sent letters to top officials of the first Bush administration to report their findings of environmental injustice and racial bias, which requested meetings to discuss the necessary governmental action. The election of Bill Clinton in 1992 signified the importance of environmental justice to the Democratic Party. Clinton appointed Reverend Benjamin Chavis and Dr. Robert Bullard to his Natural Resources Transition Team, and they helped make it an important part of his environmental policies. During his administration, environmental justice finally became federal government policy in the form of Clinton's Executive Order 12898, signed February 11th of 1994, which forced federal agencies to address the disproportionately high adverse health and environmental effects of their policies on the poor and people of color. In 1996, environmentalists who were critical of mainstream politics formed a National Green Party, which wanted to challenge the two-party system to push through the perceived need for environmental change. They began running presidential candidates the same year and successfully elected many local government officials around the country. Backlash: negative aspects of the environmental movement. The 1980s were a decade of radical environmentalism and backlash. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 marked a huge change as his conservative, pro-business ideals took office and his administration took a strong, pro-development stance, hostile to the Interior Department's traditional resource preservation orientation. He used his presidency to portray all environmentalists as radicals outside of the American mainstream. Reagan appointed Ann Burford as EPA head, who was committed to restricting the agency's enforcement of environmental regulations. From 1980 to 1983, the EPA lost a third of its budget and a fifth of its staff. This underfunding and understaffing resulted in lasting effects, meaning it couldn't fulfill all its functions. But Reagan's anti-environmentalist position was unpopular. Environmental organizations gained membership because of his policies. The Sierra Club gained almost 500,000 members from 1980 to 1990, and the Wilderness Society gained 300,000. And in the mid-1980s, many new environmental laws were passed, like the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act amendments of 1964, the Safe Drinking Water Act amendments in 1986, and the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 1986. His Republican Vice President, George Bush Sr., was a self-proclaimed environmentalist in his 1988 presidential campaign. On 1990's Earth Day, as president, he stated that every day is Earth Day for us. The 1980s also saw the environmental movement splinter as its current state faced backlash. Many radical environmentalist groups disagreed with the mainstream, claiming that they were just centralized bureaucracies that didn't care about the grassroots and who were too easily swayed to compromise their environmental agenda. One of these groups was Earth First, which appeared in 1981 with the slogan, "No compromise in the defense of Mother Earth." Their radical tactics included direct action, guerrilla theater, civil disobedience, and ecotage, which is the destruction and sabotage of equipment used for road building, clear cutting, and other environmental damage. Other radical organizations included Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, both of which had significant support. Greenpeace had aggressive campaigns against nuclear testing, whaling, sealing, nuclear power, and radioactive waste disposal, all of which got great attention in the 80s. The environmental movement on a global scale. By the end of the 1980s, the environmental movement increasingly focused on global issues, which would require international diplomacy to be solved. As scientific research advanced, the issues of global warming, acid rain, ozone depletion, biodiversity, marine mammals, and rainforests couldn't just be dealt with domestically. As the world's largest economy and consequently its largest polluter, energy consumer, and waste generator, America had a strong responsibility to participate in international agreements to protect the Earth. In 1987, the U.S. joined 139 other nations in signing the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. It pledged the signees to eliminate production of chlorofluorocarbons, which destroy the ozone layer. In 1992, the U.S. and 178 other nations met in Brazil for the Conference on Environmental Development and drafted a document proclaiming 28 guiding principles to strengthen governing over global environmental causes. In 1997, President Clinton committed the U.S. to the Kyoto Protocol, which set timetables and emission targets for reducing greenhouse gases which cause global warming, but President George W. Bush rescinded this commitment when he took office in 2001. The environmental movement, lasting impacts. In 2000, America celebrated its 31st Earth Day, and on that day, 83% of Americans polled expressed agreements with the environmental movement's goals. In 2000, the 20 largest environmental organizations in America had almost 20 million members. In 1996, the U.S. spent $120 billion on environmental control. In 1997, the EPA reported that the air was the cleanest it had been since they had started keeping record in 1970, and the emission of 6 major pollutants was down by 31%. In 2000, they reported that the release of toxic materials had declined 42% since 1988. But the fight for environmental justice is far from over. At the end of the 1990s, 62 million Americans lived in places that didn't meet federal standards for clean air or water. And, as in the current day, we face a presidential administration that, in some aspects, doesn't even believe in climate change. It is more important now than ever for the environmental movement to continue to grow and fight for the preservation of our planet. This is confirmed by my primary source, political science professor Patrick McGuinn of Drew University, who states that, in an era where there is scientific consensus and substantial empirical evidence about climate change and its damages, the Trump administration has decided to ignore the data and has appointed a head to the EPA who does not believe in its existence. It is not an overstatement to say that the fate of the world is at stake. Rising global temperatures and sea levels and increasing severe weather threaten us all. The action taken in the next few decades will determine the health of all future generations. In the words of environmentalist Rachel Carson, author of Silent Spring, we stand now where two roads diverge, but unlike the roads in Robert Frost's familiar poem, they are not equally fair. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth superhighway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled by, offers our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth.